Leon Degrelle is one of the most controversial figures of the Second World War, mostly because he never backed down and always spoke proudly of his actions after the war, rather than claiming he was manipulated by Hitler or some sort of other excuse that many used to justify why they did what they did. Most probably felt the same as Degrelle inside, but they didn't escape. He did. He was free to speak openly. He escaped to Franco Spain and lived out the rest of his life there, dying at the old age of 87. A video going over Degrelle's life would be a mountain in itself, as it's so undercovered by historians. Degrelle, however, gives us a full account of his legion's actions on the Eastern Front. For those unaware, Leon Degrelle was a Belgian journalist, politician, then soldier. He formed the Walloon Legion, and it was to become the textbook example of how an SS unit should be run, and Degrelle viewed as a model volunteer. At one point, Hitler told Degrelle that if he had a son, he wished he was like him. He was the most decorated volunteer there was, and about as well decorated as a soldier could be in general. Obviously, Germany lost the war, but the fate of the volunteer divisions was always up in the air. How would they be treated? Not well, was the answer. Many were executed after the war, many more thrown into jail cells to rot. The only option when the collapse at the end of the war came was to escape. This is Degrelle's insane escape story. Before we begin, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons. Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, and Chechen Natsok for making these videos possible. With their support, I will soon be able to make these videos full time and be able to make them both better quality and more of them. Every donation helps, even the $2 tier. So if you enjoy these videos and have a few dollars lying around spare, please consider donating. You have no idea how much it helps. Also, my Telegram, which is pretty busy now, is down below. Thank you. The end of March 1945 saw the final collapse of the Western Front. The Rhineland had been overrun, and the Rhine River crossed by Patton and Montgomery. The defence of the West had been half-hearted for a while now regardless. The fear lay in the East. The Allies were seen as an annoyance, involving themselves while the Germans and their allies were trying to fight the main enemy, the Soviet Union. Degrelle made sure his men were posted there too, like the majority of the troops fighting. His Walloon boys had signed up to go on crusade against communism, not to fight the British or the Americans. In The Eastern Front, written by Degrelle himself, which I'll quote from a lot here, he describes the state of the Western Front. Between the Americans and Berlin, everything was totally deserted. The front had vanished. Nothing came out to meet the Yankees any longer. The highways were empty. Degrelle and his men were at Stettin, where General Steiner was making fanciful plans for a counterattack. To observers, the war was clearly over, but that did not stop the Germans fighting. Conquering the Baltic coast had been a bloodbath for the Soviets. Degrelle had been promised the command of a new army corps comprising the French Charlemagne Division, his Walloons, and the Flanders Divisions. He found this fanciful. In his words, I remained skeptical. I like to stick to realities. With my survivors from Pomerania, my cannoneers without cannons, and my engineers without pontoons, I still had barely enough men to reform a serious infantry regiment. The Germans had sent him some reinforcements, Walloons who had been working in German factories. Degrelle refused to accept them. No matter how desperate they were for men, he would stick to his principles. This was a legion of volunteers. He would never wish for anyone to be forced into this hell if they didn't share his worldview. While some German generals had illusions that the Anglo-Americans would make war on the Soviets when they reached the Oder, and even thought the progress of the Allies in the West too slow, Degrelle knew the reality. He trembled to think of the fate of his 1,000 or so survivors in his division. A single Soviet thrust could encircle and destroy them. He was right to fear what was to come. Through the Red Cross, the Allies had promised that foreign volunteers would be treated like any normal soldiers. At first, the news reassured his men. At the end of the war, though, his heroes of the Russian front, men who had gone on crusade against communism, much like Churchill himself had pushed for decades, were, in Degrelle's words, delivered up to the terrible Belgian political police, held up to public scorn, thrown into dungeons or into concentration camps like common criminals. Hundreds were condemned to death, and several thousand to dozens of years in prison by makeshift tribunals whose imbecility and blatant prejudice amounted to madness. Degrelle headed to Berlin in April. There, some of his men, despite the madness, were still publishing their daily French-language newspaper, L'Avenir. He found a wreck of a city. Bombs had fallen everywhere, and the defences were a shambles, but yet there was no looting, and most of society continued with incredible stoicism. The old men of the Volkssturm and the boys of the Hitler Youth awaited the enemy with incredible calm. Degrelle compared them to the Great Teutonic Knights. The north remained relatively quiet as each side waited across from each other on the Oder River, until finally, on the 20th, Hitler's birthday, the Soviets launched a full assault and crossed the river en masse. In reality, the artillery had one, maybe two shells a day to spare on the Axis side. The Soviets, an unlimited supply, with thousands of guns pounding every inch of ground. The result was predictable. The Walloons fulfilled their oath to the end and rushed to defend the riverbank. They fought till the end, but they were torn to pieces. There simply was not enough of them. The Latvians tried to reinforce them, but were harried by Soviet air power the entire way, and they themselves were hardly in a state to fight anymore. The manpower to hold the front was near non-existent. Degrelle describes the horrifying scene at length. "We weren't going to disobey after 4 years of obedience. Our companies charged once again, and were horribly decimated each time. Captain Tyson, the unforgettable Tyson, of the Sharkassi Kessel, one of the most outstanding specialists in hand-to-hand combat, was hit by 3 bullets. He succumbed atop a pile of Soviet corpses. Lieutenant Regibo, already wounded 7 times on the Eastern Front, was wounded numerous times by exploding shells, his whole body streamed with blood. Lieutenant Albert Verputten, a dynamic young writer full of humour, was stopped cold in mid-leap. His forehead was wounded, but he didn't realise the rest. He wanted to sponge it off. 'I don't have an arm anymore,' he screamed, horrified. Then he collapsed." Regardless, they held on unshakably to their assigned positions until the 25th, when the orders came to abandon their positions and retreat to the new defensive line. Both wings had been pushed through by masses of Soviet tanks anyway, and the position was pointless. They ended up at Prenzlau to the west of Stettin, north of Berlin. They didn't remain there long. The Soviets pushed around them, and orders couldn't get through. They had to withdraw, and so they did, to the north. Columns of refugees clung to them as they withdrew. They had no choice but to accept them, even though they had little or nothing to offer them. Hundreds of thousands were fleeing the waves of Soviet rape and murder in the East. As the famous Anthony Beaver quote goes, "Every woman in the path of the Soviets, aged 8 to 80, was raped. Many, gang raped. Many still, killed afterwards." A great march northwest began. From the British broadcasts he heard on the radio he kept in his car, Degrelle knew their destination, Lubeck. If the Brits reached Lubeck, they would be trapped, hemmed in from both sides, and subject to the whims of the victorious powers. This was never an option. They set off for Lubeck. Degrelle arranged for thousands of foreign worker cards to be delivered to him. He distributed them to his men. If needs be, they could get into civilian clothes and blend in with the fleeing masses of actual foreign workers on the trek west to escape the Soviets. Over 3,000 of his men would be saved in this manner by seeking refuge in Belgium or Germany with friends. They avoided the horrors of the internment camps. Back to the situation at hand though, there was only one option. The writing was on the wall, if it wasn't before. Trying to resist the Soviets in open Germany was suicide. The only route open to them was north, Denmark and Norway. Here, in Degrelle's mind, either the struggle would be able to continue up there, or at least they could somehow find an escape, at least for a time. So the initial waves of bloodthirsty revenge that inevitably followed war would pass his men by. A radio broadcast from the Brits came in that peace discussions would be held with Himmler, who Degrelle knew was also in the area. Degrelle explains his other objective as he set off north. "I decided to see Himmler, whatever the cost, to obtain clear orders from him for my division and for the Flanders division, to remind him of the existence of tens of thousands of foreign volunteers, the bravest of the brave. Would they still be remembered in the discussions at Lubeck, or would they be left to sink into the abyss?" The road to Lubeck was brutal. The RAF was strafing the mass columns of people heading north, be it soldiers or civilians. Every 5 minutes, Degrelle and his Walloons would dive into the bushes to avoid the planes, emerging to find dead women and children everywhere among the smoke, destroyed cars, and baggage. Eventually, they arrived. Degrelle was escorted to Admiral Dönitz's headquarters, where he was given the news that Hitler had died. At first, he could barely believe it. His quest to find Himmler continued, but he couldn't be found. He made the long drive northeast of Lubeck to his headquarters, but Himmler arrived and left again by plane before he could talk to him. He did, however, sign Degrelle's order that his men be withdrawn to near the Danish border, and was told to meet Himmler there. He set off again. The future was unclear. Since the death of the Führer, the German people seemed dead inside, as if a part of them had died too. Degrelle describes how it seemed as if no one felt sorry for themselves, they only felt sorry for the Führer. The future was now up in the air. Who was in command? Who was issuing orders? Degrelle desperately tried to secure some kind of respectful end to this saga for his men who had fought so hard under him on the Eastern Front. He says, "I had made a firm resolution. Either the fate of the anti-Bolshevik volunteers would be precisely settled at the time of the armistice, or as a foreign unit, we would not consider ourselves bound by the German negotiators. We would fight like hell as long as possible until we had guaranteed a humane and honourable surrender. To help towards this solution, since I was the founder of the Legion, I decided to give myself up to the Belgian political police, but on the condition that my blood, offered as a tribute of hatred, would buy the salvation of my companions at the Eastern Front. Otherwise, we would continue to fight with all we had after the armistice." When Degrelle reached Himmler's command post near the Danish border, nobody knew where he was. He explains the chaos in the area. Every kilometre had been blasted with orgiastic fury by the low-flying British Tiefflieger. Wretched women and little girls with their legs twisted, tibias broken by horrible incendiary cartridges, lay in the embankments and at the thresholds of houses, vainly waiting for help. It was an apocalypse from Lubeck to Oiten. Hundreds of refugee carts and military trucks were in flames. There was nothing left of the highway but a column of fire. Disaster struck. The British had reached Lubeck. There was no going back. Degrelle was now separated from his men. He was in total anguish. He could do nothing to help them. All he had with him was 2 officers and a soldier. There was nothing left to do but escape. Everybody headed north. He found Albert Speer himself trying to frantically clear the roads. Then he spotted Himmler's car. His little Volkswagen was no match for Himmler's powerful vehicle, but he headed off after him. He tracked him down, and he found his self-control impeccable in the face of disaster. "I am German," Himmler said to him. "I will not leave German soil." He kept his word. He advised Degrelle to get himself to Copenhagen and regroup his men there. He made some parting remarks to Degrelle, which meant the world to him. He had immense respect for Himmler. He said, "You have been among the faithful, you and your Walloons. You were the last to stay by our side through the fighting and the misfortune. One day, Germany will remember." Then he said ominously, "Degrelle, you will be needed one day. Everything will change quickly. Gain yourself 6 months. You must live." Who knows what Himmler had in mind, or what he thought would turn the tide of the war, whilst everything was so utterly lost. Regardless, he would soon be dead in British captivity in a shag. Some say he took cyanide, others believe he was murdered. The official report looks sketchy either way. Degrelle continued north. After bumping into Himmler's entourage one more time on the roads, he would never see him again. After getting through Kiel, which was under heavy bombardment, he made it to the Danish border. The border was choked with soldiers and Swedish Red Cross trucks, carrying political refugees from German concentration camps. German troops were forbidden to cross into Denmark, but eventually, permission was secured. Degrelle headed onwards towards Copenhagen. Crowds greeted to cheer the prisoners brought home by the Swedish Red Cross, and men showed their fists at Degrelle. The situation was turning hostile, and anyone associated with the Reich lived in fear of reprisals, but ultimately he made it to Copenhagen, where he was met with the greatest news he could possibly have hoped for. A group of Walloon soldiers had made it to Copenhagen already by sea. They met each other with great shouts of joy. The plan was to head to Norway, either to escape or to get to the last bastion against communism. 300,000 German soldiers were massed up there, well armed and well supplied. The Walloons' transfer was set for the next day. Things were so much different here than in Germany. It was a carnival day. Jugglers were in the streets. The town square was full. People were happy. Just across the Baltic Sea, thousands of women and children were being shredded to pieces by RAF incendiary bullets, or raped and murdered by the Soviet horde. But here, life was tranquil. After months of privation and barely any food, that evening Degrelle and his men dined on pastries, butter, cream, eggs, and bacon. It seemed a ridiculous comparison to what they had just come from. Suddenly, the mood soured. The capitulation of Denmark was announced. The mousetrap had shut. It was the evening of May 4th. Many of Degrelle's men became jumpy. Some panicked and rushed off to the German staff office for answers. They were struck down by the mobs in the streets and killed. Degrelle was in a state of siege. Partisans with machine guns were everywhere. He and his men were split up in different parts of town by now, and it was just him and another. Suddenly, a blue limo pulled up with Danish plates to the front door. The driver told them to put on civilian clothes and get in. They weren't allowed to bring any weapons. They were to respect the word of the Reich. The German troops in Denmark had capitulated. He would have to hope that they could get out and the mob wouldn't get them. They had no way of defending themselves now. It was a gamble, but his only option. Their destination was the harbour. A few German ships still occupied it. It would be their only safe haven. The driver bluffed them past some partisans with machine guns by waving at them, then sped off when they got close before they could react. The situation got untenable, and crowds were everywhere, dragging collaborators from their homes and lynching them or throwing them into vans. It seemed that hope was lost. Suddenly, a window opened. The Danish communists attempted to seize the harbour, and the Germans resisted. Machine gun fire rung out, and everyone rushed into their houses. They took their chance and made it to the harbour in the midst of the chaos. Here, ships were carrying 20,000 Germans sat there, waiting. They had to make a break for Norway. The troops in Norway weren't included in the capitulation. Everyone was unsure of what to do. The British would be here soon. Degrelle saw a British plane land right above his head at the airport. There was no time to lose. By 6 in the evening, hundreds of British transport planes had landed. They were now effectively in enemy territory. Degrelle's commander took him by the shoulders and said, No, it will not be said that Germany abandoned you." He called over a young minesweeper commander and said to him, "You're going to break a passage through. I want you to get to Oslo with Degrelle." At 6:30 p.m, right in front of the British, they made their escape. They headed towards the Swedish coast, and then north, towards Norway. British planes flew low next to the ship, wondering what this ship was doing. Had they not just capitulated? No one on the ship reacted, and luckily for them, the planes left them alone. Around 10 in the morning, they arrived safely at Oslo. They made a call, and a car came for them. They headed to meet Dr. Terboven, the German governor of Norway, at Crown Prince Olaf's castle, at the top of a mountain. He explained his plans to the doctor, telling him they could resist the communists here in Norway, but the doctor wasn't quite as optimistic. He told him of recent events. He promised to keep Degrelle up to date on events and sent him on his way to an apartment he had reserved for him in town. Degrelle could no longer see how he was supposed to escape. He was then invited to meet the Prime Minister, Quisling. Degrelle describes Quisling as being a broken man, crushed by events, totally lost. This was to be his last visitor. A few months later, Quisling was shot. Later that day, Leon heard the latest announcement, a statement from the Reich's new Minister of Foreign Affairs. It was total capitulation, including Norway. Why sacrifice more lives for Germany when every inch of their territory had been lost? Good news for the German troops fearing for their future, but not for the foreign volunteers. Most German troops were treated properly, and in Crete given the honours of war. For Degrelle and his men, though, it was the abyss. Degrelle describes his feelings. I stayed at the window the whole afternoon. What was the good of feeling sad? I had done what I could. I had held on right to the end, obstinately, without flinching. There was no point in going north again. The North Cape, too, had capitulated. At 6 p.m. that evening, he was called to meet Dr. Terboven again. Degrelle describes them as heroically calm. Regardless, both would be dead in the waters the next morning, neither one wanting to turn over Norway to the Allies. The doctor told Degrelle that he had tried to find him asylum in Sweden, but that he was refused. He had thought about getting a submarine to take him to Japan, but with the capitulation, this was now impossible. There was only one option left. The doctor said, "At the airport at the foot of the mountain, there is still a private plane. It belongs to Minister Speer. Do you want to take your chances and try to reach Spain tonight?" In a direct line, this flight was 2,150 kilometers away. It wasn't impossible, but it would be very hard. However, he had no choice. I had risked my life every day for 2 weeks. I would risk it again, one last time, he said. The plane couldn't leave until dark, so he waited in his hotel. At 11 p.m., his pilot turned up. Degrelle describes his exit. The crowd was demonstrating everywhere in the streets. I was still in the uniform of a Waffen SS colonel, and I was wearing the oak leaves and the Knight's Cross ribbon around my neck. Tens of thousands of tall blonde boys and girls with perfect features crowded the streets, but they moved aside, smiling to let the car pass. Not a single anti-tank barrier had been constructed outside of Oslo. Our pilot brought us up under the wings of the plane in the darkness without anyone noticing us. The aides took their places. 1 minute later, we were in the sky. The war did not officially end until the next day. His fate was in the hands of his pilot. They didn't even have a map of Europe. A lone plane flying across this gigantic stretch of land was an extremely vulnerable target. They flew as high as they could to both conserve fuel and avoid detection. However, if there was any night to do it, tonight was the night. The Allies down below were in jubilant celebration, far too busy to bother with them in the sky. To further add to the ruse, their route took them towards the coast of England and then directly south, even though their plane was still proudly wearing its swastikas. The ruse didn't work. They were caught. Searchlights lit up the sky and the radio began to crackle, the Allied observers asking them who they were and what they were doing. They didn't reply. They simply kept pushing on. They were above Degrelle's home nation of Belgium at this point. He thought of home, the towns he had spoken at, the people he missed so much, the beautiful countryside. He would never see it again. He gritted his teeth to stop him from tears. They pressed on deep into France, but the pilots looked worried. The fuel situation was perilous. They were past Paris, over halfway there. The situation became terrible. The pilots' faces looked drawn and terrified. They were by the sea by this point. The pilot brought them life jackets. The engine kept misfiring, the fuel gauge was showing empty, and they were running on their last few drops. The Spanish border and the Pyrenees Mountains were in the distance. It was a coin flip if they would make it or not. They were almost there, but they had nothing left in the tank. It was up to fate. The pilot tilted the plane left to right, again and again, to make sure that the last drops would flow into the motors. The plane was coming down though. They were near water level. 20 kilometers from the Spanish coast, and it looked like they were going to fail. So close, yet so far. They fired off their flares. 2 military patrol boats set off, but from the French coast. Yet they could see a Spanish searchlight in the distance. The right motor exploded. The plane went down to the sea, and that was it. Degrelle received 5 fractures, but they bailed out. They were right on the Spanish coast. Spaniards on the beach rushed to their aid, and rescue vessels quickly approached them and pulled them in. They were saved. They had fallen at the last hurdle, but they had made it there in one piece. Barely. He would spend the next few months in a hospital bed, but he was alive. Degrelle ends his account of events with these thoughts. I had kept my strength and my faith. I hadn't experienced the bitterness of falling uselessly into the hands of my enemies. I remained a witness to my soldiers' deeds. I could defend them from the lies of adversaries unfeeling their heroism. I could tell of their epic on the Donets and on the Don, in the Caucasus and at Cherkasy, in Estonia, at Stargard, and on the Oder. One day, the sacred names of our dead would be repeated with pride. Our people, hearing these tales of glory, would feel their blood quicken, and they would know their sons. And this is exactly what he did. Whether you agree with Degrelle's Walloon Legion's actions on the Eastern Front against communism or not, their bravery cannot be doubted. Most never returned home. Degrelle would spend the rest of his days in Spain, proudly recounting the events of his legion and defending their actions against the victors, who in the end obviously wrote the history books. He never turned his back on Hitler or the Third Reich until the day he died, and always spoke admiringly of them. But that is a story for another day.